ancient church bells of St. Mary's in Little Thornfield chimed 3 o'clock on what should have been the most joyous Saturday of the summer. Instead, an unsettling quiet had settled over the village green where the annual midsummer fete was reaching its cheerful crescendo. Bunting fluttered between the oak trees, the scent of fresh strawberries and cream mingled with the earthy smell of trampled grass, and children's laughter echoed off the Norman church walls. Yet beneath this pastoral perfection, something was terribly wrong. Miss Eleanor Hartwell adjusted her sensible straw hat and observed the scene from her folding chair beside the jam competition tent. At 73, she had the gift of appearing utterly unremarkable while missing absolutely nothing. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on a soft blue jumper for her great-nephew, but her sharp grey eyes were cataloguing every detail of the unfolding drama before her. The cause of the disturbance was immediately apparent. Mrs. Rosalind Ashworth stood in the centre of the green, her elegant composure cracking like fine china. Her daughter Victoria, who should have been posing for photographs in her wedding finery, was nowhere to be seen. "She was here not 20 minutes ago," Mrs. Ashworth was saying to anyone who would listen, her voice rising with each repetition. "Right here, having her photograph taken with the other brides for the Village Chronicle." She can't simply have vanished into thin air. The other brides in question were a charming tableau that had been the afternoon's highlight. 5 women from different generations, each wearing their original wedding dress for a commemorative photograph. There was elderly Mrs. Pemberton in her 1943 utility dress, Mrs. Davies in her 1960s mini-dress creation, young Mrs. Foster, who had married just last year, and Mrs. Caroline Webb, the doctor's wife, representing the elegant 1980s. Victoria Ashworth, engaged to be married next month to the village's most eligible bachelor, had been the centrepiece in a borrowed Victorian gown from the church's historical collection. Miss Hartwell had been watching the photography session with the mild interest of someone who had witnessed 60 years of village life. She had noted how Victoria seemed unusually fidgety, her smile bright but brittle. The young woman had kept glancing toward the church, where her fiancé, David Thornton, was helping to set up the evening's dance in the parish hall. "Perhaps she's simply gone to powder her nose," suggested Mrs. Davies kindly, though her voice lacked conviction. "I've checked the church, the parish hall, even the vicarage," Mrs. Ashworth replied, wringing her hands. "Mrs." Foster saw her walking toward the old cemetery path, but that was the last anyone remembers. Miss Hartwell's needles paused mid-stitch. The old cemetery path led to the abandoned section of the churchyard where weathered headstones from centuries past leaned at odd angles among the brambles. It was not a place one wandered casually, particularly not in a valuable antique wedding dress. The photographer, a nervous young man from the county paper, was packing his equipment with obvious relief. "I'm sure she'll turn up," he said, though he seemed eager to escape the growing tension. "Brides get overwhelmed sometimes. All that pressure." But Miss Hartwell noticed something others had missed. Victoria's small, beaded handbag lay forgotten beside the church steps, its contents spilled slightly. A lipstick, a handkerchief, and something that glinted in the afternoon sun. Miss Hartwell rose quietly and made her way over, her movements casual but purposeful. "Oh, Victoria's dropped her bag," she observed mildly, kneeling to collect the scattered items. Among them was a small silver locket, its chain broken. Miss Hartwell examined it briefly before anyone else noticed, noting the inscription inside, "To my darling V, forever yours, M." The initial puzzled her. Victoria's fiancé was David, not M, and the handwriting was distinctly feminine. "Miss Hartwell, have you seen anything?" Mrs. Ashworth approached, desperation creeping into her voice. "You were sitting right here the whole time." "I'm afraid I was rather absorbed in my knitting," Miss Hartwell replied gently, slipping the locket discreetly into her pocket. "Though I did notice Victoria seemed a bit unsettled." Perhaps the heat was troubling her. As the afternoon wore on, the search expanded. David Thornton had emerged from the parish hall, his face pale with worry. The local constable was summoned, though he seemed more accustomed to dealing with lost sheep than missing brides. Volunteers spread out across the village calling Victoria's name, but the only response was the echo of their own voices. Miss Hartwell remained at her post, observing the human drama with the keen attention she had once applied to unruly pupils. She noticed how Mrs. Ashworth's concern seemed tinged with something else. Embarrassment, perhaps, or fear. She observed David's genuine distress, but also caught a fleeting look he exchanged with Mrs. Caroline Webb, the doctor's wife, that seemed oddly significant. Most intriguingly, she watched as Mrs. Webb quietly removed something from the ground near where the brides had been photographed, a small white flower crushed underfoot. Orange blossom, Miss Hartwell realized, though none of the women had been wearing it in their bouquets. As the sun began to set and the fête officially ended, Victoria Ashworth remained missing. The bunting that had fluttered so gaily now seemed forlorn, and the laughter had died away entirely. Little Thornfield faced an uncomfortable truth. Their second bride in 50 years had simply vanished without a trace. Miss Hartwell folded her knitting carefully and prepared to walk home to her cottage. But her mind was already working, turning over the small details others had overlooked. The broken locket, the orange blossom, the meaningful glance between David and Mrs. Webb. In her experience, when young women disappeared, it was rarely without reason, and somewhere in the back of her memory, a half-forgotten story stirred. Something about another bride, long ago, who had also failed to return home. The morning after Victoria's disappearance dawned grey and drizzly, as if the very sky mourned the disruption of little Thornfield's peaceful existence. Miss Eleanor Hartwell woke earlier than usual, drawn to her kitchen window that overlooked the village green. The scattered remnants of yesterday's fête, a forgotten balloon caught in the church gate, paper cups rolling in the morning breeze, seemed almost obscene in their cheerful normalcy. She had spent a restless night turning the small silver locket over in her hands, studying its delicate engraving and the mysterious inscription, "To my darling V, forever yours, M." The broken chain suggested it had been torn away suddenly, perhaps in struggle or haste. But who was this mysterious M? And why had Victoria been carrying such a personal token from someone other than her fiancé? By 8:30, Miss Hartwell had dressed and made her way to the village shop, ostensibly for her morning paper, but really to gauge the community's mood. The shop buzzed with nervous energy, filled with villagers reluctant to return to normal routines, while Victoria remained missing. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Thornfield, David's aunt, bustling through the door with an air of importance. "That girl has run off. All this wedding pressure, some people simply can't handle it." Miss Hartwell found this assessment rather harsh, particularly from someone who should have shown more concern for her nephew's distress. She lingered over the biscuit selection, appearing absorbed while her ears remained sharply tuned to the conversation. "That's cruel, Margaret," chided Mrs. Pemberton gently. "Victoria seemed devoted to David." "Did she?" Mrs. Thornfield's eyebrows rose sceptically. Caroline Webb mentioned seeing Victoria in rather intense conversation with someone at last month's church fête. Someone who wasn't David. Miss Hartwell's hand paused over the biscuit tin. Mrs. Caroline Webb again. The doctor's wife seemed remarkably observant about Victoria's activities. "Who was it?" pressed Mrs. Pemberton. Caroline thought it might have been that young woman from the Greater Thornfield Library. "Miranda something. You know, the one with the rather mannish haircut." "Miranda Hartley," supplied Mr. Foster helpfully. "She cycles through here sometimes. Keeps to herself, mostly." The name sent a small shock through Miss Hartwell's system. Miranda, M. The locket's inscription suddenly took on new significance. After collecting her purchases, Miss Hartwell walked directly to the church. Mr. Pritchard, the verger, was already there, polishing away yesterday's fingerprints with the air of someone desperately seeking normal tasks. "I wonder," she said pleasantly, "if the Victorian gown is still in the vestry." "It is," he replied with relief at a practical question. "Brought back late yesterday after the commotion, folded as best we could manage." He hesitated, then added, "There's tearing at the hem, thorns, I expect." "The old cemetery path will do that, and the orange blossoms from the wreath were never returned to the box." Mrs. Webb said she'd check her things at the hall. Orange blossoms. Miss Hartwell remembered seeing Mrs. Webb quietly retrieve something from the ground near where the brides had posed. Orange blossom was traditionally associated with weddings, symbolizing purity and fertility, but it didn't grow wild in their part of England. Someone had brought it deliberately. "The vestry window?" she inquired with idle curiosity. "Ajar when it shouldn't have been," he admitted. Locked at noon, but at 5 it looked meddled with. Could be the heat, could be anything. From the church, Miss Hartwell walked to the cobbler's shop, where Monica Blake worked as the village seamstress. The bell chimed as she entered, and Monica looked up from a length of muslin, her expression brightening, then softening as brightness felt inappropriate. "The Victorian gown presented you with difficulty?" Miss Hartwell asked gently. "Terror, more like," Monica laughed nervously. "Those old stitches are like cobwebs." Miss Ashworth was very precise about the fit. Called twice last week wanting the bodice altered. It didn't really want altering. I just tacked it. She paused, flushing slightly. She asked about the wreath, too. Said it had gone missing. I told her I hadn't seen it. "And had you?" Miss Hartwell asked with pure curiosity. "No," Monica said too quickly, her fingers smoothing the muslin nervously. "I'd have been afraid to breathe on it." She sank her needle through the cloth with unnecessary force. "People do like to make stories, don't they? About brides and old paths. When I was a child, they talked about Margaret Whitmore. Ran off before her wedding in 1925, they said. Never found." Miss Hartwell's pulse quickened. Another bride, another disappearance. "I remember the stories," she said carefully. Walking home, Miss Hartwell's mind arranged the morning's discoveries like pieces of a complex puzzle. A missing wreath of orange blossoms, a locket inscribed by someone named Miranda, a dress with dark history, a seamstress who knew more than she admitted, and Mrs. Webb, always present, always helpful, always watching. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though its full shape remained hidden. But Miss Hartwell had learned long ago that in villages like Little Thornfield, the past never truly stayed buried, and sometimes, when old secrets stirred, they demanded new victims to keep them quiet. She touched the locket in her pocket and quickened her pace. There were more questions to ask, and she suspected time was running short. That afternoon, Miss Hartwell made her way to the Ashworth residence, a handsome Victorian house that commanded an excellent view of the village green. She carried a small basket of her homemade jam, the sort of neighbourly gesture that opened doors and loosened tongues in times of crisis. Mrs. Ashworth received her in the drawing-room, though the woman's usual composure had cracked like fine porcelain. Her hands trembled as she poured tea, and Miss Hartwell noticed a half-burned envelope on the mantelpiece, its edges charred as if hastily pulled from the fire. The letterhead, though partially consumed, bore the distinctive crest of Greater Thornfield Library. "You're very kind to come, Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice strained. "This whole business is simply dreadful. The shame of it all." "Shame?" Miss Hartwell inquired gently, accepting her teacup with steady hands. Surely concern for Victoria's safety is what matters most. Of course, of course." Mrs. Ashworth's fingers worried at her wedding ring. "But what will people say?" A bride vanishing from her own village fête, and David is beside himself with worry. She paused, glancing toward the singed envelope. "There have been complications lately." Victoria became quite obsessed with that old dress, insisted it was meaningful somehow, and she'd been asking the most peculiar questions about Margaret Whitmore. Miss Hartwell's attention sharpened. Margaret Whitmore? The girl who disappeared in 1925, before her wedding, just like... Mrs. Ashworth's voice trailed off, the parallel too painful to complete. Victoria found some old newspaper clippings in the attic. She became quite morbid about it all, talking about patterns and history repeating itself. "And the correspondence from Greater Thornfield?" Miss Hartwell asked with gentle curiosity, nodding toward the mantelpiece. Mrs. Ashworth flushed. "Oh, that. Something about the Village Chronicle project. I meant to show it to Victoria, but with all the wedding preparations..." She stood abruptly, moving to block Miss Hartwell's view of the envelope. "I'm afraid I'm not very good company today." Miss Hartwell took her leave graciously, but not before noticing a framed photograph on the side table. A young Victoria with another girl, both perhaps 10 years old, standing beside a bicycle. The second girl had short dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed familiar. Her next stop was Mrs. Pemberton's cottage, where she found the elderly woman deadheading roses with unusual vigour. "Such a terrible business," Mrs. Pemberton said without preamble, though I must say Victoria seemed quite distracted during the photography session. She kept fingering something at her throat, A locket, I think. When the photographer asked us to remove modern jewellery, she was most reluctant. Did you notice anything else unusual? Caroline Webb was rather flustered about the orange blossom wreath. She'd brought it specially from her greenhouse, she said, but when it went missing just before Victoria disappeared, she became quite upset. More upset than seemed warranted for a few flowers. Mrs. Pemberton snipped another dead bloom with particular force. And Mrs. Foster mentioned seeing a bicycle propped against the cemetery wall, said it looked too well maintained for someone visiting old graves. Miss Hartwell made her way to the post office, where Mrs. Fielding was sorting mail with unusual concentration. Dreadful about Victoria, the postmistress said immediately, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. There have been letters, you know, coming here addressed to Victoria, but not in David's hand. Feminine writing, rather urgent-looking. The return address was always Greater Thornfield Library. How long had these been arriving? 3 or 4 months. Victoria would collect them herself, very quietly, and read them right here at the counter. She always looked troubled afterward, folding them very small before putting them away. Armed with this information, Miss Hartwell walked slowly toward the old cemetery path. The drizzle had stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture. The path was overgrown and treacherous, brambles catching at her sensible skirt as she picked her way between ancient headstones. Near the far wall she found tire tracks in the soft earth and caught on a thorn bush, a small piece of white fabric with tiny seed pearls, clearly torn from the Victorian dress. More significantly, hidden beneath an old stone slab, she discovered the missing orange blossom wreath, carefully placed as if creating a shrine. As she examined the wilted flowers, footsteps approached on the path behind her. Miss Hartwell turned to see Detective Inspector Finch, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanour. "Miss Hartwell," he nodded curtly. "Any insights from your observations?" "Only that young women rarely vanish without reason, Inspector," she replied diplomatically. "And reasons in villages like Little Thornfield often have roots that stretch back further than one might expect." He grunted dismissively. "We're pursuing all avenues, including voluntary departure. She's of age, after all." After the inspector left, Miss Hartwell remained in the cemetery, turning the evidence over in her mind. The secret correspondence with someone at Greater Thornfield Library, the carefully hidden orange blossom wreath, Victoria's obsession with Margaret Whitmore's disappearance, and the bicycle that didn't belong, all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan. But as she prepared to leave, she noticed something else: fresh oil stains on the old iron gate that led from the cemetery to the lane behind the doctor's surgery. Someone had recently maintained that gate, ensuring it would open silently when needed. Miss Hartwell touched the locket in her pocket and felt the familiar tingle that accompanied the solving of complex puzzles. The pattern was becoming clearer, though several crucial pieces remained frustratingly hidden. Someone in Little Thornfield knew exactly what had happened to Victoria Ashworth, and Miss Hartwell was beginning to suspect that someone was closer to home than anyone imagined. The morning after Miss Hartwell's discoveries at the cemetery brought an unwelcome development that she had nonetheless anticipated. Detective Inspector Finch arrived at the village with the satisfied air of a man who preferred his mysteries solved quickly and his suspects obvious. By 10 o'clock, David Thornton had been arrested and taken to the county station, leaving Little Thornfield buzzing with shock and vindication in equal measure. Miss Hartwell learned of this development while purchasing her morning paper at the village shop, where Mrs. Thornfield was holding court with barely concealed triumph. "I told you all," Margaret Thornfield declared to the assembled customers. "That girl was trouble from the start." Poor David was simply driven to desperation by her behaviour. All that secretive correspondence, those mysterious meetings with that library woman. What was a decent man to think? "But surely David wouldn't harm Victoria," protested Mrs. Pemberton weakly. "He seemed so devoted to her." "Devotion can turn to violence when a man feels betrayed," Mrs. Thornfield replied with authority. "The inspector found evidence, you know. Victoria's jewellery in David's possession, including that locket she was always fingering. He claimed she'd given them to him for safekeeping, but who believes such nonsense?" Miss Hartwell's attention sharpened at the mention of the locket. She had been carrying the broken piece in her pocket since finding it at the church steps, but if the police had recovered Victoria's jewellery from David, then either there were 2 lockets, or someone had planted evidence with remarkable efficiency. She made her way to the parish hall, where Inspector Finch was conducting interviews with the air of a man tying up loose ends. The inspector received her with barely concealed impatience. "Miss Hartwell, I trust you're satisfied with our swift resolution of this matter. Young Thornton has confessed to arguing with Miss Ashworth on the morning of her disappearance. A lover's quarrel that escalated beyond his control, I'm afraid." "How convenient that he was caught with her jewellery," Miss Hartwell observed mildly. "Indeed. Claimed she'd asked him to take it to London for insurance appraisal, if you can credit such a story. We found a note in her handwriting arranging to meet someone at the old cemetery gate. The pieces fit together quite neatly." Miss Hartwell's unease deepened. In her experience, pieces that fit together too neatly often concealed a more complex puzzle underneath. "And the locket's inscription? 'To my darling V, forever yours, M.'" Finch waved dismissively. "Obviously refers to some childhood friendship. Girls do exchange such trinkets. The important thing is that Thornton had it in his possession after her disappearance." After leaving the inspector, Miss Hartwell walked thoughtfully toward the doctor's surgery. The timing of David's arrest troubled her almost as much as the convenient discovery of evidence. Someone had moved very quickly to ensure the investigation would focus on the obvious suspect, leaving the real perpetrator free to cover their tracks. She found Mrs. Caroline Webb in her conservatory, tending to her exotic plants with the focused attention of someone seeking distraction from unpleasant thoughts. The doctor's wife looked up as Miss Hartwell entered, her smile bright but brittle. "Miss Hartwell, how good of you to call. This business with poor David has shaken us all terribly. To think we never suspected—" "Indeed," Miss Hartwell agreed, moving to admire the orange blossom plant. She noted the fresh cuts where several branches had been recently harvested, and the slight tremor in Mrs. Webb's hands as she pruned. "Your flowers for the photography session were particularly lovely. Such a shame about the missing wreath." "Missing?" Mrs. Webb's voice carried a note of surprise that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hadn't realized it was missing." There was such confusion after Victoria's disappearance. Miss Hartwell examined the plant more closely, noting how the remaining blossoms had been carefully tended, almost protectively. Orange blossom is quite symbolic, isn't it? Traditionally associated with weddings, but in some cultures it represents secrets kept and truths hidden. The pruning shears slipped in Mrs. Webb's grasp, nicking her finger. A drop of blood fell onto the white petals below. "I'm afraid I don't know much about flower symbolism. I simply thought they would photograph well." "Of course." Miss Hartwell's tone remained conversational, but her eyes were sharp. "Though I noticed the gate behind the cemetery has been recently maintained. The hinges are quite well oiled now. Very thoughtful of someone to ensure it opened silently." Mrs. Webb's composure flickered momentarily. "The squeaking was disturbing patients during consultations. My husband asked me to see to it." "Naturally." Miss Hartwell moved toward the window that overlooked the lane. It must provide a convenient route for someone familiar with the area. One could move between the surgery and the old cemetery quite discreetly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Mrs. Webb set down her pruning shears with unnecessary care. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you're not suggesting anything improper. My husband and I have lived in this village for 15 years. We've contributed to every charity, helped in every crisis. The idea that we might be involved in something so dreadful—" "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Hartwell replied gently, "merely observing that in villages like little Thornfield, those who help most often see most, and sometimes what they see requires careful handling." As she prepared to leave, Miss Hartwell noticed a small detail that confirmed her growing suspicions. On the potting bench lay a gardening glove, its palm stained with what looked like oil, the same dark oil she had observed on the cemetery gate. Walking home, Miss Hartwell reflected on the morning's revelations. David Thornton's arrest had been swift and convenient, but it raised more questions than it answered. The locket in police custody suggested either remarkable carelessness on David's part or careful planning by someone else. Mrs. Webb's nervous energy and the evidence of her recent activities around the cemetery gate painted a picture of someone working hard to manage a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. Most troubling was the realization that if David was innocent, then Victoria's real fate remained unknown, and her captor was still free in Little Thornfield. Miss Hartwell touched the broken locket in her pocket and quickened her pace. Time was running short, and she suspected that whoever had orchestrated David's arrest would not hesitate to eliminate any remaining threats to their carefully constructed deception. The pattern was becoming clearer, though its full implications remained hidden. But Miss Hartwell had learned long ago that in matters of murder, the most helpful neighbours often proved the most dangerous, and the most obvious solutions usually concealed the most complex truths. That evening, Miss Hartwell sat in her cottage parlour with the broken locket spread open on her writing desk beside a magnifying glass. The inscription, "To my darling V, forever yours, M," had been troubling her since the discovery, but now a more pressing question demanded attention. She reached for her telephone and dialed the county station. After some pleasant conversation about delivering a casserole to the constables, she managed to inquire about Victoria's recovered jewellery. The desk sergeant was happy to oblige her seemingly innocent concern about a broken chain catching on delicate fabrics. "Oh no, miss, the locket we found was quite intact." Chain and all. Lovely piece, really. Shame about the rest of this business. Miss Hartwell thanked him and replaced the receiver, her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. 2 lockets meant careful planning by someone who understood the value of planted evidence. She examined the broken locket once more, noting how the chain had been severed with deliberate force rather than accidental wear. The next morning brought another revelation. Miss Hartwell made her way to the church, where Mr. Pritchard had kept Victoria's spilled handbag locked safely in the vestry cupboard. She examined its contents with the methodical attention she had once applied to her pupil's arithmetic. The expected items were there: powder compact, lipstick, handkerchief, but tucked beneath them lay a thin card from Greater Thornfield Library. It was a borrowing slip in neat handwriting. Parish Records, Little Thornfield, Register of Banns, 1918 to 1928. Requested by V. Ashworth, reference made by M. Hartley. There was also a bus timetable with the 5:10 departure to Greater Thornfield circled in pencil, and wedged into the inner pocket, a small brass key on a loop of tape. "Odd little thing, mister," Pritchard observed of the key. "We've no lock that size in the church proper." But Miss Hartwell had noticed something else. She moved to the Victorian dress, now carefully folded after yesterday's examination. Monica Blake had mentioned unnecessary alterations to the bodice, claiming she had merely tacked it. Miss Hartwell's experienced fingers found what they sought, a small seam restitched with different thread, easily overlooked by casual inspection. With delicate care she unpicked a few stitches. Inside the lining lay a thin, brittle piece of parchment, folded multiple times. The handwriting was elegant but faded, dated 1925. "My dearest M, I cannot go through with it. He knows. He will ruin everything. I've found the truth, hidden in the church records, and I must expose him. I've left the proof in the only place I know it will be safe. I will meet you at the old stone wall at sundown. Forever yours, Margaret." Margaret Whitmore's final message, hidden in the very dress she had planned to wear to her wedding. The parallel with Victoria's situation was unmistakable. Another bride, another mysterious M, another dangerous secret threatening to surface after decades of burial. Miss Hartwell carefully restored the letter to its hiding place and made her way to the post office to place a telephone call to Greater Thornfield Library. "Good morning. I'm calling about one of your staff members, Miranda Hartley." "I understand she's been corresponding with someone in Little Thornfield." The librarian's response was immediate and definitive. "I'm sorry, but we have no one by that name on our staff. We haven't had a Miranda employed here for several years." Miss Hartwell thanked the librarian and hung up, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The correspondence Victoria had been receiving, the mysterious meetings, even the name on the locket, all carefully constructed elements of an elaborate deception. She walked slowly home, her mind arranging the evidence like pieces of a complex mathematical equation. Victoria's research into Margaret Whitmore had uncovered something dangerous, something worth killing for. The fake Miranda Hartley had been created to control and manipulate Victoria's investigation. The orange blossom wreath, the oiled cemetery gate, the planted locket, all suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the village and access to its hidden corners. As she reached her cottage, Miss Hartwell noticed Mrs. Webb tending her garden with unusual intensity, her movements sharp and agitated. The doctor's wife looked up as Miss Hartwell passed, her smile bright but strained. "Such a relief about David's arrest," Mrs. Webb called out, "though one does feel sorry for the boy. Passion can drive people to terrible acts." "Indeed," Miss Hartwell replied mildly, "though I've always found that the most terrible acts often spring from fear rather than passion. Fear of exposure, perhaps, or fear of losing something precious." Mrs. Webb's pruning shears paused mid-cut, and for a moment her carefully composed mask slipped. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Hartwell." "Of course not, my dear. I was merely thinking aloud about human nature. Such a fascinating subject, don't you find?" As Miss Hartwell continued to her door, she felt the weight of Mrs. Webb's gaze following her. The forgotten detail was no longer forgotten. It was a hidden letter that connected past and present, revealing a pattern of deception that spanned generations. Victoria had discovered Margaret Whitmore's secret, and someone in Little Thornfield would kill to keep it buried. The game was entering its final phase, and Miss Hartwell knew she must proceed with utmost care. The real murderer was still free, still dangerous, and increasingly desperate to protect their carefully constructed lies. That afternoon, Miss Hartwell made her way to Monica Blake's sewing shop, where she found the seamstress working on a christening gown with unusual concentration. The delicate white fabric seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, and Miss Hartwell noticed how Monica's hands trembled slightly as she guided the needle through the silk. "You mentioned your mother worked at Whitmore House," Miss Hartwell began gently, settling into the chair beside Monica's workbench. "I wonder if she ever spoke of Margaret's final weeks." Monica's needle paused mid-stitch. She glanced toward the shop window, ensuring they were alone, then set down her work with deliberate care. "Mother didn't like to speak of those times, said they brought her nothing but trouble. But when she was ill, near the end, she told me things she'd kept buried for 60 years. Miss Hartwell waited with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed to emerge at their own pace. Mother said Miss Margaret had been asking questions about the parish records, births, deaths, marriages. She'd found discrepancies, things that didn't match what people remembered. Mother saw her copying entries into a little notebook, always very secretive about it. Monica picked up her needle again, using the familiar motion to steady her nerves. And there was a man who came to visit Miss Margaret several times. Not her intended. Someone older, more distinguished. Mother thought he might be from the church hierarchy come to investigate the irregularities Miss Margaret had discovered. Did your mother know what these irregularities concerned? Deaths, mostly. People who died without family, whose estates went to the church. Mother said there were more of them than seemed natural, and Miss Margaret had begun questioning whether all those deaths were natural. Monica's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Mother thought Miss Margaret had found evidence of something terrible, something worth killing for. Miss Hartwell absorbed this information with growing unease. The pattern was becoming clearer. Margaret Whitmore had discovered systematic corruption within the church, possibly involving the deliberate elimination of vulnerable parishioners for their property. It was the sort of scandal that would have destroyed not just individuals, but the entire foundation of trust upon which village life depended. From Monica's shop, Miss Hartwell walked to the home of Mr. Davies, the village historian. She found him in his study, surrounded by the accumulated records of Little Thornfield's past. His eyes lit up when she mentioned her interest in the 1925 period. "Fascinating year," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "So much change, so much uncertainty." The Whitmore disappearance was just one of several unusual events. We also had the sudden death of old Samuel Webb, the churchwarden, just days after Miss Margaret vanished. Heart attack, they said, though he was only 52 and had seemed in perfect health. Miss Hartwell's attention sharpened. Samuel Webb, any relation to our current doctor? Webb? His grandfather, yes. Samuel had been churchwarden for nearly 20 years, very involved in the parish finances. After his death, they discovered significant irregularities in the accounts. Nothing criminal, you understand, just poor record-keeping. His son Thomas took over the position and spent years sorting out the confusion. And Thomas Webb's family? Married young Caroline Whitmore in 1926, Margaret's younger sister, as it happens. Rather sudden, that marriage, coming so soon after the tragedy. But Caroline was devoted to clearing the family name, worked tirelessly to restore confidence in the church finances. The pieces clicked into place with almost audible precision. Caroline Webb, née Whitmore, had married into the very family her sister had been investigating. Whether from love or calculation, she had spent nearly 60 years protecting the Webb name while burying the truth about Margaret's discoveries. Miss Hartwell thanked Mr. Davies and made her way to the church, where she found Mr. Pritchard organising hymn books in the vestry. She produced the small brass key from Victoria's handbag. "I wonder," she said casually, "if you might recognise this key. It seems rather old, possibly for something in the church." Mr. Pritchard examined it carefully. "Why, that's for the old document chest, the small compartment where the church wardens used to keep sensitive papers. We haven't opened it in decades. Most people have forgotten it exists." "Might we take a look?" "I have reason to believe it may contain information relevant to our current difficulties." The document chest stood in a corner of the vestry, its oak surface darkened with age. The brass key fit perfectly into a nearly invisible lock on the side panel. Inside the narrow compartment, Miss Hartwell found a collection of papers tied with faded ribbon and a small leather journal. The journal belonged to Samuel Webb, and its final entries painted a disturbing picture. Margaret Whitmore had indeed discovered evidence of systematic fraud, forged death certificates, manipulated wills, and the suspicious deaths of elderly parishioners whose property subsequently passed to the church. Samuel Webb's handwriting grew increasingly frantic as he described Margaret's investigation and her threats to expose the corruption. The final entry, dated 3 days before Margaret's disappearance, was particularly chilling. "She knows everything. Caroline has been watching her, reporting back to me, but M. Fair is too clever. She has hidden the evidence somewhere safe and plans to present it to the bishop. I cannot let this happen. The family name, the church's reputation, everything depends on stopping her. Caroline understands what must be done." Miss Hartwell carefully replaced the documents and locked the compartment. The truth was now clear. Margaret Whitmore had been murdered to protect a conspiracy of fraud and theft that reached to the heart of Little Thornfield's religious and social structure. Caroline Webb had been complicit from the beginning, first as her sister's betrayer, then as her husband's accomplice in covering up the crime, and now, 50 years later, when Victoria's research threatened to uncover the same buried secrets, Caroline had orchestrated another disappearance. The orange blossoms, the fabricated correspondence, the planted evidence against David, all were part of an elaborate plan to eliminate the threat while directing suspicion elsewhere. As Miss Hartwell walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the terrible irony of Caroline Webb's position. For 6 decades, she had lived among the very people her family had victimized, playing the role of the helpful doctor's wife while guarding secrets that would destroy her if revealed. The weight of such deception would have crushed a lesser person, but Caroline had not merely survived. She had thrived, becoming one of the village's most respected citizens. But secrets, Miss Hartwell knew, were like wounds that never properly healed. They festered beneath the surface, poisoning everything they touched. And now, with Victoria's disappearance, the infection had finally broken through, threatening to consume not just Caroline Webb, but the entire community she had spent her life deceiving. The game was entering its final phase, and Miss Hartwell knew she must proceed with utmost caution. Caroline Webb had already proven herself capable of murder to protect her secrets. She would not hesitate to kill, again if she felt cornered. The morning after Miss Hartwell's discoveries brought disturbing news that confirmed her worst suspicions. Mrs. Ashworth had been found unconscious in her drawing room, a half-empty bottle of laudanum beside her chair. Dr. Webb pronounced it an accidental overdose brought on by the stress of Victoria's disappearance. But Miss Hartwell detected the faint scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air, a telltale sign that suggested something far more sinister than laudanum. More significantly, the partially burned envelope from Greater Thornfield Library had vanished from the mantelpiece, removed with the same methodical efficiency that characterized all of Caroline Webb's actions. Miss Hartwell made an unusual decision that afternoon. She would visit David Thornton in jail. A quick telephone call to her solicitor nephew secured her a visiting appointment, and by 3 o'clock she sat across from the young man in the county jail's sparse visiting room. David looked haggard, his usual confidence replaced by bewildered desperation. "Miss Hartwell, I don't understand any of this. Victoria gave me her jewellery that morning, said she wanted me to keep it safe during the fete. The locket was particularly precious to her, she said, but she wouldn't explain why." "Did she seem different to you in those final weeks?" Miss Hartwell asked gently. "Very different. Secretive, excited about some research she was doing. She mentioned Margaret Whitmore several times, said she'd found something important in the old church records." David's voice dropped. "And there was someone else, a woman she'd been meeting. I saw them once near the old cemetery. Older, elegant, giving Victoria a small package wrapped in brown paper. Victoria seemed pleased but nervous about it. Miss Hartwell's pulse quickened. The mysterious meetings, the package exchange, all pointed to Caroline Webb's elaborate deception using the Miranda Hartley persona. Returning to Little Thornfield as evening approached, Miss Hartwell made her preparations with the careful attention of someone who understood that the end game was at hand. She wrote 2 notes in her precise handwriting. The first went to Mr. Pritchard, asking him to keep watch at the church that night. The second she slipped under the surgery door. "Margaret's letter survived where you thought it had been destroyed." She then visited Monica Blake, asking the seamstress to come by her cottage after supper to help with a sewing project. "Take the long route past the green," she suggested casually, "and do keep your silhouette visible in the lamplight. It would comfort me to see you working." As darkness fell, Miss Hartwell positioned herself at her parlour window with her knitting, watching the lane that connected the surgery to the old cemetery. Monica sat where the lamplight would show her profile clearly to anyone observing from outside. At 9:30, a shadow moved across the hedge. Miss Hartwell called out, her voice carrying just enough. "The church will be locked at 10, you know. Anyone needing to retrieve what they left had better hurry." The shadow paused, then moved quickly toward the cemetery path. Miss Hartwell extinguished her lamp and, with Monica following quietly, made her way to the church where Mr. Pritchard waited with a lantern. They positioned themselves in the deep shadow of the old ash tree, with clear views of both the vestry door and the surgery's back gate. At 9:20, the gate opened silently, and a figure in a dark coat slipped through, moving with practiced confidence toward the church. Caroline Webb fitted a key into the vestry door with unhurried precision, but as the door swung open, Miss Hartwell spoke from the darkness. "Keys are so useful when they open the locks we expect, Mrs." Webb Caroline turned slowly, her face composed even in the lantern light. "Miss Hartwell, how thoughtful of you to check on the church security. I was just retrieving some documents for Inspector Finch." "At this hour? And with such careful preparation?" Miss Hartwell stepped into the light, her voice gentle but implacable. "I think we both know why you're really here. The question is whether you came to hide something or to retrieve it." Caroline's eyes moved quickly, to Mr. Pritchard's lantern, to Monica's white face, calculating odds and options. For a moment, the careful mask slipped, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. "Some secrets are worth protecting," Caroline said quietly. "Some truths do more harm than good." "Perhaps. But the choice of which truths to reveal shouldn't rest with those who profit from keeping them buried." From the lane came the sound of approaching footsteps. Inspector Finch, finally responding to reports of unusual activity at the church. Caroline gathered herself, her composure returning like armour. "We shall have to continue this conversation another time, Miss Hartwell. I'm sure you understand." She turned toward the surgery gate, but Miss Hartwell's voice stopped her. The second bride was never meant to be Victoria, was it? She was meant to be the one who would discover the truth and pay the price for it. Just as Margaret did 50 years ago. Caroline paused without turning back. "History has a way of repeating itself, Miss Hartwell. Sometimes it's the only way to preserve what matters most." As Inspector Finch's lantern appeared on the path, Caroline Webb melted back into the shadows, leaving Miss Hartwell with the certainty that the final confrontation was yet to come, and that time was running dangerously short. Inspector Finch's dismissive attitude toward the previous night's encounter left Miss Hartwell unsurprised but undeterred. The inspector had examined the vestry with perfunctory attention, found nothing immediately incriminating, and departed with his faith in David Thornton's guilt intact. Caroline Webb had provided tea and wounded dignity in equal measure, expressing shock that anyone might question her nocturnal concern for church security. Miss Hartwell spent the morning at the county records office, her methodical approach yielding disturbing patterns that confirmed her suspicions. The marriage records told their own story. Caroline Whitmore had wed Thomas Webb in March 1926, a remarkably swift courtship following her sister's February disappearance. More revealing were the property transfers between 1920 and 1925, 7 elderly parishioners dying intestate, their modest estates passing to the church under Samuel Webb's careful administration. But it was Mr. Davies who provided the missing piece that transformed suspicion into certainty. She found him in his study, surrounded by chronicles and parish registers, his face grave with discovery. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding patterns," he began, without preamble. "There was another bride, Miss Hartwell. Ellen Pierce, in 1987. She worked as bookkeeper at the surgery and had been asking questions about discrepancies in the church accounts. Engaged to marry, she borrowed the Victorian wedding dress for photographs, the same dress Victoria wore. 3 days before her wedding, she drowned at the ford. Accidental death, they ruled, though she was an excellent swimmer." Miss Hartwell absorbed this revelation with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solver, finding the crucial piece. 3 brides across 6 decades, Margaret in 1925, Ellen in 1987, Victoria now. Each had discovered something dangerous. Each had been eliminated before she could speak. The pattern was not coincidental. It was methodical. "Who organized Ellen's funeral arrangements?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "Caroline Webb, the elder Caroline doctor. Peter's grandmother. She wore mourning for months afterward, though she barely knew the girl. Rather excessive, people thought, but she claimed it was Christian duty." From the records office, Miss Hartwell made her way to the hospital where Mrs. Ashworth was recovering from her laudanum incident. She found Dr. Webb hovering protectively beside his patient, his professional manner unable to disguise an underlying tension. "Such a near thing," he murmured, ushering Miss Hartwell away from the bedside. "The stress of Victoria's disappearance has been overwhelming. We've had to increase her sedation to ensure proper rest." Miss Hartwell noted the empty laudanum vial on the bedside table and the doctor's protective positioning over Mrs. Ashworth's handbag. I understand she had been receiving correspondence from Greater Thornfield Library. Rather concerning letters, by all accounts. Dr. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My wife mentioned Victoria's research into old village tragedies. Rather morbid obsession, if you ask me. Sometimes it's better to let the past remain buried. The phrase struck Miss Hartwell as particularly revealing. Dr. Webb was clearly more than a passive observer. He was an active participant in his wife's efforts to control the narrative. Her afternoon was spent in the church where Mr. Pritchard had become unexpectedly helpful in her investigations. Together they examined the old charnel chamber behind the vestry, a forgotten space that had been bricked up decades earlier. "The mortar around the lower courses looks freshly attended," Mr. Pritchard observed, running his fingers along the wall. "Someone's been testing these bricks recently, though I can't imagine why." Miss Hartwell crouched beside him, noting the telltale smears of machine oil along the brick edges, the same heavy oil she had observed on the cemetery gate. Someone had been preparing this space, perhaps as a temporary hiding place or worse. In Samuel Webb's hidden journal she found the final confirmation. His increasingly frantic entries detailed not just the systematic fraud, but Margaret Whitmore's discovery of what he called the secret repository in the old vicarage foundations. Margaret had found the evidence of their crimes and hidden proof in a location she believed would be safe from discovery. The pattern was complete now, spanning 3 generations of careful deception. Caroline had betrayed her own sister to protect the Webb family secrets, then spent 60 years maintaining that protection through manipulation, intimidation, and when necessary, murder. Victoria's research had threatened to expose not just the historical fraud, but Caroline's role in covering it up. As evening approached, Miss Hartwell made her preparations with the methodical care of someone who understood that endgames required precision. She wrote carefully worded notes, one to Inspector Finch, suggesting he examine the charnel chamber with proper authority, another to the bishop requesting urgent review of historical parish finances, and a third to Monica Blake, asking her to be visible at her cottage window that evening. The trap she was setting required Caroline to believe she had one final opportunity to silence the threat Miss Hartwell represented. The broken locket, the hidden documents, the pattern of 3 brides, all pointed toward a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Miss Hartwell touched the locket in her pocket and reflected on the terrible irony of Caroline's situation. For 60 years, she had lived among the very people her family had victimized, playing the role of helpful neighbor, while guarding secrets that would destroy everything if revealed. But secrets, like wounds that never properly heal, eventually demand their price. The bells of St. Mary's chimed 7 o'clock, and Miss Hartwell knew the final act was about to begin. Miss Hartwell positioned herself in her parlour that evening, with the deliberate care of a chess player arranging pieces for checkmate. The broken locket rested prominently on her windowsill, clearly visible to anyone, observing from outside, while her knitting lay untouched on the side table. She had spent the afternoon crafting her most dangerous gambit yet, a carefully worded note slipped under the surgery door that would force Caroline Webb's hand. At precisely 8 o'clock she began her performance. Moving to her telephone, she placed a call to the county station, speaking loudly enough for her voice to carry through the open window. "Inspector Finch? Miss Hartwell here. I believe I've found something rather important regarding Victoria's disappearance. Yes, Margaret Whitmore's final letter. It was hidden in the Victorian dress all along, and it names her killer quite explicitly." She paused, allowing the silence to stretch meaningfully. "The evidence is quite damning, I'm afraid. Could you come by first thing tomorrow morning? I'll have everything ready for you then, including the original documents from the church vestry." She replaced the receiver and settled back at her window, noting with satisfaction how the surgery's curtains had twitched during her conversation. Caroline Webb would now face an impossible choice: allow Miss Hartwell to present her evidence to the authorities, or take one final, desperate action to protect secrets that had already cost 3 lives. The waiting proved shorter than anticipated. At 8:30, a soft knock came at Miss Hartwell's door. She opened it to find Caroline Webb standing on her threshold, elegant as always despite the late hour, though her usual composure showed hairline cracks around the edges. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I saw your lights and thought perhaps you might appreciate some company during these trying times." "How thoughtful of you, Mrs. Webb. Do come in." Miss Hartwell stepped aside, noting how Caroline's eyes immediately sought the locket on the windowsill. "I was just having some tea. Would you care for a cup?" "That would be lovely." Caroline settled herself carefully in the chair facing away from the window, her positioning calculated to keep Miss Hartwell between herself and any potential observers from outside. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed rather animated on the telephone earlier." Miss Hartwell busied herself with the tea service, her movements unhurried despite the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. "Oh, that. Yes, I've made some rather disturbing discoveries about our missing bride, and about Margaret Whitmore, as it happens. The parallels are quite remarkable." Caroline's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "Margaret Whitmore? Such an old tragedy. I can't imagine what relevance it might have to Victoria's situation." "Can't you?" Miss Hartwell settled into her own chair, her grey eyes sharp with quiet intelligence. "I find the connections fascinating. Both young women researching parish records, both discovering uncomfortable truths about systematic fraud in the church, finances, both vanishing just before they could share their findings with the proper authorities. Coincidence, surely. Small villages do tend toward repetitive patterns." Miss Hartwell reached for the locket on the windowsill, turning it over in her hands with deliberate slowness. "This belonged to Victoria. Rather interesting inscription. To my darling V, forever yours, Emorm." The police found an identical locket in David's possession, of course, but this one tells a different story entirely. Caroline's composure flickered momentarily, like a candle flame in a draught. "I'm sure I don't understand what you're implying." "The M doesn't stand for Miranda Hartley, does it?" "There never was a Miranda Hartley at Greater Thornfield Library. I checked quite thoroughly." "The M stands for Margaret. This was Margaret Whitmore's locket, given to her by someone she trusted completely. Someone close enough to know her intimate thoughts, her fears, her discoveries about Samuel Webb's systematic murder of elderly parishioners for their property." Miss Hartwell's voice remained conversational, but her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Someone who betrayed that trust to protect family secrets." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Caroline set down her teacup with exaggerated care, her hands trembling slightly. "You have quite an imagination, Miss Hartwell, but imagination isn't evidence." "Indeed not. Evidence is what Margaret hid before she died, evidence that Victoria found and tried to share with her mysterious correspondent. But you created the Miranda Hartley persona to control Victoria's investigation, to discover exactly how much she had learned and whether your family's secrets were truly safe." Miss Hartwell leaned forward slightly. "You've been manipulating her for months, haven't you? Drawing her deeper into the mystery while preparing to eliminate her, just as you eliminated Margaret and Ellen Pierce." Caroline's mask was finally slipping, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Some secrets protect more than they harm, Miss Hartwell." Margaret was going to destroy innocent people with her revelations. The fraud was Samuel Webb's crime, not ours. But the scandal would have ruined everyone. The church, the village, families who had done nothing wrong. "So you arranged for your own sister to disappear. Margaret chose her fate when she chose justice over family loyalty." Caroline's voice had hardened, losing all pretense of gentility. "I gave her every opportunity to reconsider, to think of the consequences for the living. But she was stubborn, idealistic. She couldn't see the greater good." Miss Hartwell nodded slowly, as if Caroline's words confirmed something she had long suspected. "And now, Victoria." "Where is she, Mrs. Webb?" Caroline stood abruptly, her composure cracking completely. "Somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. The old ice house behind the surgery. She's quite comfortable there, though she won't be causing any more trouble for anyone." The admission hung in the air between them, final and damning. Miss Hartwell had her confession and, more importantly, Victoria's location. But she also understood that Caroline Webb, having revealed so much, would not allow her to leave this room alive to share it. The weight of Caroline's confession hung between them like a death sentence, and Miss Hartwell understood with perfect clarity that she had pushed the confrontation beyond any possibility of retreat. Caroline Webb, having revealed Victoria's location and her own culpability, would not permit her to leave this cottage alive to share such damning knowledge. Caroline moved with deliberate calm toward Miss Hartwell's writing desk, her fingers closing around a silver letter opener that gleamed in the lamplight. "You've been remarkably thorough, Miss Hartwell, but thoroughness without discretion can prove quite fatal." Miss Hartwell remained seated, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, despite the mortal danger now filling her small parlour. "I wonder, Mrs. Webb, if you've considered the practical difficulties of your current position. Inspector Finch is already aware of my discoveries. I telephoned him before you arrived, not during our conversation as you witnessed." Caroline's composure flickered momentarily. "You're lying." "Am I? Perhaps you should look toward the church bell tower. Mr. Pritchard has been watching with field glasses since 9 o'clock, as I arranged. Monica Blake maintains her vigil at her window, with instructions to summon help at the first sign of disturbance." Miss Hartwell's voice remained conversational, though her grey eyes never left Caroline's face. "And David Thornton will be released within the hour, thanks to certain evidence I provided to his solicitor this afternoon." The letter opener trembled in Caroline's grasp as the full scope of Miss Hartwell's preparation became clear. The elegant facade that had sustained her for 60 years began to crack like fine porcelain under pressure. "You cannot comprehend what you're destroying," Caroline whispered, her voice breaking. "The stability, the respect, the good we've done for this village. Samuel Webb made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we spent decades building something better on those foundations. Built on the graves of 7 innocent people, Miss Hartwell replied gently, and maintained through the murder of 3 young women whose only crime was seeking truth. The letter opener clattered to the floor as Caroline's carefully constructed world collapsed around her. She sank into the opposite chair, her face buried in her hands, and the words began pouring out like water from a broken dam. Margaret was going to destroy everything, she sobbed. She'd found Samuel's records, the forged death certificates, the manipulated wills. She had proof that he'd been poisoning elderly parishioners and stealing their property for the church. She was going to take it to the bishop, to the authorities. She didn't care about the consequences. The scandal would have ruined not just our family, but the entire foundation of trust in Little Thornfield. Miss Hartwell listened with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime drawing truth from reluctant sources. "So, you betrayed your own sister." I tried to reason with her first. I met her in the old charnel chamber where she'd hidden the evidence. I begged her to think of the living, of the good that could still be done. But she was stubborn, idealistic. She turned to leave, and I pushed her. She struck her head against the stone wall. Caroline's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was meant to be an accident, but when I saw she was dead, I realized it solved everything. I dressed her in the wedding gown, took her to the cemetery path where the brambles would catch the fabric. Everyone assumed she'd run away rather than face marriage. And Ellen Pierce in 1987? She found the old surgery ledgers while doing the bookkeeping. The same evidence Margaret had discovered, hidden away but never destroyed. I couldn't let it happen again. Another scandal, another threat to everything we'd built. I met her at the ford, told her I wanted to discuss a reasonable solution. But when she insisted on going to the police, Caroline's hands trembled violently. I held her under the water until she stopped struggling. She was young and strong, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. The sound of approaching vehicles filled the night air. Inspector Finch's motor car, followed by the local constabulary. Miss Hartwell rose gracefully, moving toward the door with unhurried dignity. "And Victoria discovered the pattern," she observed, more statement than question. She found Margaret's final letter sewn into the wedding dress lining. She knew about the charnel chamber, the systematic fraud, everything. I created the Miranda Hartley correspondence to control her investigation, to discover exactly how much she'd learned. When I realized she had enough evidence to expose us, I lured her to the church under pretense of showing her more documents. I meant to stage another accident, but she fought, she screamed. I had to drug her with laudanum from the surgery stores and hide her in the ice house until I could arrange something more permanent. Inspector Finch's authoritative knock interrupted Caroline's confession. Miss Hartwell opened the door to find him accompanied by 2 constables, their faces grim with purpose. "Inspector," she said calmly, "Mrs. Webb has just provided a complete confession regarding Victoria's disappearance, as well as the murders of Margaret Whitmore and Ellen Pierce. You'll find Victoria alive, but drugged in the ice house behind the surgery." Caroline Webb rose with the dignity of someone who had finally laid down an unbearable burden. She offered her wrists to the constables without resistance, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I regret the necessity," she said quietly, "but never the intention. Some secrets are worth protecting, even at such a terrible cost." As the constables led Caroline away, Miss Hartwell accompanied Inspector Finch to the ice house, where they found Victoria conscious but weak, her wedding dress torn and stained, but her spirit unbroken. The young woman's first words were of gratitude mixed with bewilderment. "I thought Miranda would come for me," she whispered, as Miss Hartwell helped her to her feet. "The letters promised she would keep me safe." "Miranda was a fiction, my dear," Miss Hartwell replied gently. "But the truth she helped you discover was very real indeed." Dawn was breaking over Little Thornfield as the ambulance carried Victoria to hospital, and Caroline Webb began her journey to the county jail. The documents hidden in Samuel Webb's secret compartment would provide all the evidence needed to confirm her confession and close cases that had haunted the village for generations. Miss Hartwell returned to her cottage as the sun painted the church spire gold, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The broken locket lay beside her teacup, its secret finally revealed after 60 years of silence. Margaret Whitmore's voice had spoken across the decades, and justice, though long delayed, had finally found its way home to Little Thornfield. The pattern was broken at last, and the village could begin to heal from wounds it had never known it carried. 3 weeks after Caroline Webb's arrest, Little Thornfield had settled into the peculiar quiet that follows revelation, not the peaceful silence of contentment, but the thoughtful hush of a community learning to see itself with new eyes. The summer heat had broken with thunderstorms that seemed to wash more than dust from the ancient stones, and Miss Hartwell observed the subtle changes in her neighbours with the same keen attention she had once applied to particularly complex arithmetic problems. Victoria had recovered from her ordeal with remarkable resilience, though the experience had transformed her in ways both visible and hidden. She spent her mornings helping with the church restoration project. The discovery of Samuel Webb's systematic fraud had necessitated a complete audit of parish finances dating back to 1920. In the afternoons, she could often be found tending to Margaret Whitmore's newly marked grave, where a simple headstone now read, "Margaret Whitmore, 1903 to 1925, Truth Seeker." The wedding to David had been postponed indefinitely, not from lack of affection, but from a mutual understanding that some foundations required rebuilding before new structures could be safely erected upon them. David Thornton had returned to Little Thornfield a changed man, his easy confidence replaced by something deeper and more considered. He had taken charge of the complex process of returning misappropriated funds to the families of Samuel Webb's victims, displaying an unexpected talent for patient, detailed work that suggested his character had depths previously unexplored. Dr. Peter Webb had departed for London without ceremony, unable to bear the weight of his family's legacy. His surgery stood empty now, its dark windows reflecting the village's complicated relationship with secrets that had finally demanded their price. The patients had been redistributed to neighbouring practices, though the loss of their familiar physician added another layer of adjustment to Little Thornfield's carefully ordered existence. Inspector Finch had made several visits to Miss Hartwell's cottage, his initial scepticism replaced by genuine curiosity about her methods. During one such visit, as they examined Samuel Webb's hidden journal in the church vestry, he had asked how she had known Caroline would confess when confronted. "Because carrying such secrets for 60 years creates an unbearable burden," Miss Hartwell had explained, her fingers tracing the faded ink of Samuel's increasingly frantic entries. Caroline Webb had spent her entire adult life performing a role, the helpful doctor's wife, the pillar of the community, the devoted sister mourning her lost sibling. When that performance was finally challenged with irrefutable evidence, the relief of dropping the mask outweighed the fear of consequences. The inspector had departed with grudging respect, though he maintained that proper police procedure would have achieved the same results with less civilian risk. Miss Hartwell had accepted this criticism graciously, privately reflecting that proper procedure would likely have resulted in David Thornton's conviction for a crime he hadn't committed. From the bishop came formal acknowledgement and promises of restitution. Those families who could still be traced would receive compensation from the church's accumulated assets, while the remainder would establish a memorial fund for village improvements. The tone of the official correspondence sought dignity, but betrayed institutional exhaustion, the recognition that some wounds, however old, still demanded tending. Monica Blake had proven instrumental in the aftermath, her mother's memories providing crucial corroboration for Caroline's confession. The seamstress had also taken charge of properly preserving the Victorian wedding dress, which would be displayed in the church as part of a memorial to the 3 young women who had died seeking justice. As autumn painted the hedgerows in shades of gold and amber, Miss Hartwell found herself spending more time in the old cemetery, where she had developed the habit of visiting Margaret Whitmore's grave during her evening walks. The orange blossom wreath had been replaced with fresh flowers each week, first by Victoria, then by other villagers who had come to see Margaret, as something of a local saint. On one such evening, as Miss Hartwell knelt to arrange late roses with careful precision, she reflected on the curious nature of human evil. It had not arrived in Little Thornfield wearing horns or carrying a scythe. It had baked for fetes and organised rosters and oiled hinges, so that doors would open silently when secrecy mattered most. It had believed in the village so passionately that it could not bear to let the village see itself as it truly was. That was perhaps the most dangerous sort of devotion, the kind that smothers truth in the name of love. The broken locket now rested in Miss Hartwell's jewellery box, no longer evidence but remembrance. Margaret Whitmore's voice had finally been heard across 6 decades of silence, carried on the courage of another young woman who had dared to seek uncomfortable truths. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Hartwell considered how little Thornfield would heal from its wounds. The village would emerge changed, more honest perhaps, but also more aware of the darkness that could lurk beneath the most respectable facades. Trust, once shattered, would slowly begin to mend piece by careful piece. As the church bells chimed 8 o'clock, Miss Hartwell reached her cottage door and paused to look back at the green, now washed by the gentle light of early autumn. Justice, when it comes so late, is a thinner soup than one might wish, but even thin soup warms the hands, and warmth, she had learned, was often enough to sustain hope through the longest winters. She touched the door handle and smiled quietly. Somewhere, she knew, another puzzle was already taking shape, waiting for the gentle but relentless hand that would eventually bring it to light. The world, after all, was full of such fascinating patterns, if one only knew where to look. The brides who never returned had finally come home.